How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today marks the third review video on this channel and the first ever Rewind review, and I am very excited to talk to you all about MDC's 1982 self-titled LP. Just a reminder that for the $10 option on my Patreon, I will review any punk record of your choice on both Patreon and YouTube. So whether that's your band, a friend's band, or just any old band you like, it's all fair game. This episode was actually requested by Patreon supporter Project CS, so big shout out to them. Thanks for the support and the request. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are at least somewhat familiar with MDC already, but just in case you aren't, the band was formed in Austin, Texas by vocalist Dave Dichter, guitarist Ron Posner, drummer Al Schvitz, and bassist Michael Donaldson. They would later go on to sign with Alternative Tentacles and relocate to the Bay Area, and have since become a cult favorite punk band for the past 3 to 4 decades. Their music is defined by these really sharp, buzzy guitar tones, lightning fast drum grooves, and a really powerfully shouted vocal delivery. And they would be a reasonably influential band on not just the Texas punk scene, but really on hardcore in general. However, I might be one to argue that MDC's impact is felt a little more on the activist and progressive politics side of punk than the music. As I'm sure many of you guys know, Dave Dichter has historically been an important figure when it comes to LGBT rights and activism in the punk scene, and especially so being as loud about it as he was back in the early 80s. As for this album, though, if you don't already know, it's the first one in MDC's catalog, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are already fairly familiar with it, but just in case you aren't and want to check it out, you can find a link to it in the description below. But I think that's enough background info, so let's dive into this thing. Like a lot of records from its era, this is a very fast-paced album, and in fact, its first 3 tracks fly by in less than 5 minutes. But despite things blasting through at such a rapid pace, this record still showcases a reasonably strong grasp on songwriting, albeit a little rougher around the edges. I think something that really helps this record and MDC as a band stand out is Dave Dichter's powerful, shouty vocals that manage to deliver his lyrics in a very clear and precise manner, which is something pretty rare for punk of this era. And this also helps some of the otherwise pretty straightforward tracks pop a little more, with Dave's vocals and sharply delivered lyrics providing them with a great deal of memorability. A few of the most notable examples of this on the album I thought were the tracks Corporate Death Burger, My Family is a Little Weird, and Business is on Parade. And while all of these are certainly decent instrumental punk tracks on their own, Dave Dichter's vocals are what really grab the listener in the most unapologetic and shocking way possible. And additionally, on the topic of his vocals and lyrics being so up in your face and clearly understood, like I said earlier, I've always found MDC to be a very important band when it comes to punk politics, and perhaps one that you might consider entry level. While they might not be as gateway as a band like Bad Religion is in this regard, I still think MDC are a band that make punk politics fairly digestible and easy to comprehend. And I think this record is probably the best example of them doing that. Lyrics like Corporate Death Burger, Ronald McDonald, or What Makes America So Straight and Me So Bent possess a degree of humor or enticement to them that, while still acting as a method of transportation for a larger message, serve as a hook of sorts to reel the listener in. While I feel the vocals are really this album's biggest strength, though, there are a couple of places where I thought things still fell a tad bit short. Most notably is the beginning of the track I Remember, where we see Dave deliver a spoken word performance of sorts over this really abrasive instrumentation. And this is certainly something I feel can work in a live setting, especially in the presence of a larger and very engaged audience. However, I've never found it to be something that smoothly translates onto recordings and can often hinder the pacing of an album. And if I'm being completely honest, I kind of feel like that's what happens here. Like I said before, this is a very, very fast-paced record, and the fact that it blazes through track after track is another one of its biggest strengths. But this really noisy, unrhythmic interlude that seems to just be tacked on to the front end of this song, song I found really tripped up the pacing. The song itself does more than make up for it though, and without that interlude is easily another one of this record's powerhouse anthems, maintaining the same breakneck speed and fiery energy the tracks before it all seem to fly by with. Though I haven't given it much attention throughout the review so far, I also of course want to talk about the instrumentation that for the most part holds things together really well. In fact, I think this album is an early example of a sound that would become a staple of hardcore punk for years to come. These bright buzzsaw guitar tones grinding through the mix with a really punchy chord progression is something that still remains a pillar of punk rock songwriting. And while they may not be the most influential band in this regard, I still think MDC were at the very least a band that pushed things in the right direction with this concept. The drumming on this record is also absolutely stellar, and especially for its time. These kind of rapid, hammer-hitting beats have of course been a part of punk nearly since its beginning, but there's really something about the drums on this record that I again think is another thing that helped push punk and hardcore in the right direction. Unlike a lot of his peers at the time, Al Schwitz's performance is very clear and precise, and while he's certainly been overshadowed by more well-known figures of the era like Bill Stevenson and Earl Hudson, his drumming, and especially so on this album, were still a great example of how tight technical drums would quickly become the standard for punk. While the instrumentation is very strong and pronounced like the vocals are, there are still a few places where this record might sound a little bit repetitive to a non-hardcore punk enthusiast. Some of this limitation I think is definitely due to it taking more of a backseat to the lead vocals, but a number of the tracks on the back half of this LP have a way of melding together in a sense. And while I would say they're still reasonably competent as standalones, there is very much a fast hardcore formula to MDC's music that on one hand effectively establishes their identity and sound, but on the other may feel a bit repetitive on a full-length LP to somebody who isn't that into hardcore. At the same time though, MDC's music is certainly very beginner-friendly as far as hardcore goes, and the precisely executed instrumentation is another thing that I think helps make their breed of the sound a little more digestible to an untrained ear. The production on this record I also found to be very well done, and especially so for its era. While it certainly isn't up to the genre's standard today or even from that of punk 20 or 30 years ago, keep in mind this record dropped the same year Bad Brains' self-title and the Misfits' Walk Among Us did, both of which are certainly more influential records but also have pretty famously fuzzy lo-fi recordings. Whereas this album is remarkably crisp for its time, and I'd say this is another thing that MDC at least helped set a standard within punk, though they, again, maybe weren't as influential with it as a band like the Dead Kennedys or Discharge were. Overall, this record is a very, very, very fun listen, and especially if you are a hardcore punk enthusiast. And while maybe not the most influential thing of its era, I would say it still more than deserves its status as a cult classic. The composition is well above average for the time, and although it does get a tad bit repetitive towards the end, part of the reason for that I think is because of how many of the record's best tracks populate its front half, and this is certainly not the only punk record of this era that does this. Plus, its many standouts more than make up for anything that feels a bit repetitive or lackluster. Like I've been saying throughout this video, though, this record's strongest quality is definitely Dave Dichter's piercing vocals. I would argue these are some of the most clearly sung hardcore vocals of the era, and that alone is a huge part of MDC's and this record's identity. This is also a record that clings very tightly to its political message, and a vocalist can really make or break things with that concept. And truthfully, this is a fantastic example of a best case scenario with that. Overall, I think I'd give this album a solid 8 out of 10. But anyways, these are of course just my thoughts on MDC's self-titled release. Be sure to let me know what you think about this record. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you think it's an essential punk rock record? Or do you think it's more of a cult classic like I do? Let me know in the comments. Thanks again to Project ZS for their donation and suggestion, and thanks to all of you for watching. But until the next upload, I'll see you next time.